Hello, welcome to the online composition webinar. Thanks for joining. I'm not exactly sure how many people are on right now watching, but I might just wait a couple of minutes to let some people join. So I think I see there are a couple of people on, which is great. So thanks for joining. All right, I think we have a few people. So I'm just going to get started. So some of you will have received a handbook, and I'm going to show you that on the screen in a moment. So here is the handbook. This has a bit of an outline on what I'm going to do in this webinar. So the first point, why compose? I think composing is a little bit of a lost art these days compared to what it used to be when guitarists, in the 19th century, for example, Saw and Giuliani and Tárrega, they just seem to naturally be more of composers as well as guitarists. The second part I'm probably going to skip because I actually didn't put this into the booklet, and you probably know a little bit about me. I'm not actually, I wouldn't call myself a composer. I am a guitarist who just composes a little bit, but I want to encourage this sort of attitude. If you are a player primarily, it is possible to compose. It's not like I don't think you need to be necessarily like an expert in composition. As long as you can play some pieces, that sort of is a really good stepping stone for composition. The third part, how musicians used to compose. So I'll just look into a couple of methods into how composers like Fernando Sol, for example, and other composers like Bach, Mozart, Beethoven composed. So a couple of those processes are copying scores by hand, which is the fourth point. The fifth point, model composition. And then we're going to look at a couple of case studies. And then I want to talk about my course. And then I'll take some questions at the end. So I'll try to get through this as quickly as I can because I would love to get to questions. And yeah, I don't want to sort of be lecturing the whole time. So, all right, so let's begin. So why compose? What are the benefits of composing? So the obvious thing is that composition is a creative process that produces a work of art. So, you can create something really beautiful. The not so obvious thing, though, I think the thing that can be overlooked is that composition can also be a tool for learning about music. So when you compose, you don't just learn about things, but you learn how to use those things. And this includes really basic concepts to really advanced ones. So in terms of time, for example, you can learn about time and rhythm and meter, key signatures. Key signatures shouldn't be, I should have written time signatures there. Pulse, polyrhythms, hemiola. So the more sort of basic things like meter, 4/4 meter, for example. If you read about what a 4/4 meter is in a book, it's very different doing that to actually using it in a piece. You have to really think about what that means. What does a 4/4 meter actually mean? How can I use it? Then you can get into more advanced things like polyrhythms and hemiolas and syncopations, things like that. Again, they might be terms you've read about or heard about, or maybe a teacher or something has mentioned them, but by actually using them, I think you really start to understand those terms. You can learn about form, so some basic forms like binary and ternary form, and then some more advanced ones like sonata and fugue. So here is a little bit of a fugue that I wrote, and this really helped me understand the process behind a fugue. So I'll play a little bit of it for you. So that's a little bit of a fugue that I wrote. You can learn about harmony, so chords and inversions, and voice leading, extended chords, things like that. This is definitely one of my favorite topics. I think it's one thing to sort of read a harmony textbook. It's even one thing to practice harmony on the guitar, but it's a complete other thing to actually use harmony to compose a piece of music. That really, you just have to understand it in a way. Even if you don't understand it intellectually, you understand it. You have a connection to it that just reading and playing doesn't necessarily have. So these are some exercises here from my book, Fundamental Harmony. So just to give you an example of some sort of fairly basic exercises you can practice. These are triads, so C major triads, going up and down the neck, and then in a different spacing, open spacing. There, and then down the bottom here, we have something called the rule of the octave, which is a more advanced harmonic sort of progression. So all of that can be used in, they can be tools to use in a composition. So, I have an example here of how you can use triads, only triads, to create a composition. So here is the composition. I'll play a little bit of this for you. Okay, so that's what it sounds like. I didn't mean for it to be the most sophisticated and beautiful composition. I meant for it to be to represent how you can use a structure like triads to create a composition, very quickly. If you know triads, if you have them under your fingers, and you compose with them, then you're able to create a composition fairly quickly, or at least the sort of skeleton for a composition, which this could be a skeleton for one. So let's move on now to the next topic. So how musicians used to compose. Now, this is something, I'm sort of into this idea of looking back at how musicians from the past learned music, practiced music. So I've looked through many method books and studied, tried to read writings from musicians of earlier centuries. So a commonly held belief is that composition, like improvisation, is a very random act. You can only compose things when you're in the zone or when your muse magically transmits beautiful music to you. Now, I think there is some truth to this. Sometimes music can just flow out. You can just have pen to paper and just write, or you could be playing your guitar and something could just, a piece of music could just sort of spontaneously happen. But I don't think it's the only way. Composition is a process or a craft just as much as it is a mysterious phenomenon. So here I found some paintings of Saint Gregory, who's credited for inventing the Gregorian chant. He wrote a lot of chant music, and you can see, in the left painting, you can't really see the dove. You can see a little bit of its wing, but there's a dove next to him, giving him the music, telling him the music to write down. And then in this one, there's a dove telling him music to write down, and this one too. So there's this idea of a muse that sort of tells you, magic sort of gives you spontaneously the beautiful music to just write down once you have it. So here are some procedures you can use that can make composing less of this kind of random act and more of a craft, I guess, more of a method, you could say. So the first part is copying out scores by hand, which is, I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests many composers from the past used to do this. And it's we're at a funny stage now because writing by hand is sort of, or maybe getting obsolete now. So we tend to use computers to write. And so this could become very quickly a very, very lost tradition. it could already be a lost tradition, perhaps. So Luigi Cherubini, who was a highly esteemed composer in his day, wrote this about copying out scores by hand. I would induce the pupil who aims at becoming a composer to read and even to copy out with attention and with reflection as much as he can of the works of the classical composers, particularly and occasionally those of inferior composers, with the view of learning from the former what mode he is to pursue for composing well, and from the latter in what he may avoid the contrary. By such a proceeding, frequently repeated, the pupil, in learning to exercise his ear through his sight, will gradually form his style, his feeling, and his taste. It's a really interesting quote, very specifically talking about copying out music by hand, and not just to copy out pieces by, great composers, classical composers, meaning, I guess, the composers you hold in really high regard, but those of inferior composers occasionally, with the view of learning. So you want to learn from the great composers what to pursue, and from the inferior composers what to avoid. So by such a proceeding, so by copying out with attention and with reflection, that's important, frequently repeated, the pupil will learn to exercise his ear through his sight and gradually form his style, his feeling, and his taste. So this is a practice I think is very, I really think this today is already a lost tradition. You do see occasionally people maybe copying out or writing out pieces by hand, but I think it's more for a visualization, practicing purpose rather than compositional purpose. So I really encourage you, and we're going to have a look in a second at some examples of writing out things by hand. So many of the great composers, including Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart, copied out scores by hand as a means to learn about composition. Bach, I think, copied out quite a bit of Vivaldi's compositions, for example. So here are some examples by two students of mine. This is half of a piece. I'll play it for you, see if you recognize it. Probably familiar to many guitarists. So he copied that out, and I really admire the detail. It makes you really think about everything, the accent on the second beat, the slur there, the dotted dotted half note value in the bass to ring on, the dynamics, the ornaments, all these things aside from the actual notes themselves. It really helps to ingrain those things into your sort of being a bit more than just by playing or just by listening. Here's another example that I recently got from a student, and this one is probably not so well known, but I'll play a little bit and maybe some of you will recognize it. I think there's a typo there. I don't think that's correct. Checked through this in more detail. There are a couple of mistakes, and this actually happens really. It's very, very easy to make mistakes, even if you're copying. It's incredible. You'd think that it would be easy to be like 100% accurate, but it's very easy to make errors. To repeat a bar or to just read the wrong note or something like that. So that's another sort of part of this process. You have to really focus. A lot of attention is required. So copying out scores by hand is the first sort of process or method we can use to avoid, or I guess in contrary to the sort of just spontaneous way of composing. The other way, and this is very much related, is by model composition. And so this is where you model a work that you admire. And sometimes composers went so far as to borrow music which we would probably call stealing today. They would literally borrow the music so it would sound, pretty much exactly the same. And Handel is a great example of this. Sometimes he borrowed very explicitly, like, you wouldn't hear much difference between the original, but other times he borrowed and he reworked, and his work ended up sounding quite different to the original. So excuse me, Handel would often make alterations, sometimes drastic, to the borrowed music. So here is a tip that I have. Instead of borrowing explicitly, try to borrow general ideas from a composition, such as the form, texture, harmony, etc. So I took an example. This is an example by Tedesco. It's one of his studies, which are not played very much. Appunti, study number 10, sounds like this. So I took that texture and I turned it into this etude, which is an homage to Tedesco. So I'll play you a little bit of this, and this is the full piece is in the handbook. So that's what that sounds like. And so I borrowed the texture, very, very similar texture, great right hand exercise, but I changed it quite drastically in terms of the overall form, the harmony, the melody, and so on. This is, so I could talk about the differences, but those are the general differences. So that's the idea here. I took a general idea and I borrowed that, and then I created a piece of music. And this etude that I composed happened very quickly in about 1 to 2 hours, maybe even less. It was a few years ago now, when I composed it. And so modeling gives you a springboard to quickly launch your creativity from. If I didn't have that sort of seed, I would have probably been looking around for a seed for a long time before I would have had the idea to sort of launch the rest of the piece. So that's model composition there. So let's go on to some case studies now. We're going to look at a couple of pieces and just talk about the overall characteristics and features of these pieces, and maybe what you could model from. So this is Adelita, which is the piece that my student copied out by hand back here. That's Adelita by Francisco Tárrega. So let's talk about what I always like to do first when I'm looking at a composition is to look at the overall form. So look at the big picture first, and then start to sort of zoom into the smaller details. So the big picture here, we have, there's a repeat sign there and a repeat sign there, and then da capo. So we go back to the start. So we have 3 sections, A, B, A. So it's going from A to B and then back to A. So the A section here is clearly in E minor, and then the B section is clearly in E major. Very beautiful writing. And then we go back to the A section in E minor. So this is already something you could use as a model. If you wanted to, you could go from, you could use that key structure and form and model that. So you could go A, ternary form, A, B, A. And the key structure would be E minor to E major to E minor. So there's already a great starting point. And if you wanted to, you could even borrow the sort of the shortness of this piece. It's quite short. It's 2 8-bar phrases. So it's 16 bars. Well, it's 16 plus 8 bars long. It goes back to the 8 bars. but each section is just 8 measures long. So if you compose just 8 measures, then you'll basically have an A section, and that's half of the piece already, or 2/3 of the piece actually done. And if you notice, particularly with this piece, we actually have some repetition. The first 4 bars basically are repeated again. So if you compose 4 bars, you've pretty much got your A section. If you compose 4 bars that you're really happy with, you basically have your A section. Just repeat them again and finish it off. The B section here, so it goes into E major, and Tárrega gives us quite a lot of contrast, which is what we want. We want some contrast there. So it gives us a contrast in key, which automatically gives a contrast in character or contrast in mood. But he also does a lot more than that. For example, he has this beautiful bit. So 4 bars later, from the start of the section, the melody goes down into the sort of tenor there. So we hear, and then we hear it down, echoing down there. So that's a really beautiful way to kind of create unity in the section, but also variety. So that's just a look at the sort of large scale features of Adalita and ways you can model. So you could use this form, just compose 4 bars for the A section, and then for the B section, if you wanted to borrow a general idea, you could have a melody in the first couple of bars, and then in the second phrase, have that melody being thrown down into one of the lower voices. Could be the tenor, could be the bass voice, for example. So that's just a really quick look at ways you can model Adalita, or model a piece of music, model general ideas. I guess the other important thing to talk about is the fact that this is a mazurka. So knowing the features of a mazurka so that it sounds like a mazurka if you want to compose a mazurka as well. One of the features of a mazurka is that the accents shift around. They're not always on the first beat like a waltz, That would be a waltz, whereas a mazurka would be like something like that, a little bit of sort of like a drunk waltz or something, and usually quite a lot slower and more melancholy than a waltz. So by knowing that, you can see that sort of explains why those accents are there, and that just helps you to, it gives you another sort of limitation so that you're not so overwhelmed by possibilities. In the B section, there are other places, like there's an accent here on the 3rd beat, for example, and then one on the 1st beat. So you can see those shifting accents. And then another thing you could borrow overall are the ornaments. I think that's a really big feature of this. You've got the mordent there, upper mordent. You've got the glissé, the slide, another slide here, another mordent, another slide. So I think, he's using quite a few ornaments, and that's something else that you could borrow those ornaments, or you could use different ornaments, but ornamentation is something. So I guess we have form, overall form, and then we talked about the mazurka, just the features of a mazurka, shifting accents, and the ornaments. So those are just some very general things you could borrow. And in not too much time, I think you could create a really beautiful piece of music using these sort of guidelines that are based on Adalita. The second one I want to look at is the other piece that was copied out by hand. This one here. So this is a saw study from Opus 35. Study number 2 from Opus 35. So let me play. I'll play this through without the repeats so you get an idea of what it sounds like. Here we go. whole study really, Fernando Sol was, you know, an exceptional composer. Obviously, that's why he's played so much these days still. So once again, we want to look at the overall form. When we talked about Adalita, we wanted to look at the big picture first. So we found out it was ABA form. So this is a little different. We have two sections. We can see the repeats here, and it doesn't go back to the A section, you know, after the conclusion of the B section. So it's binary form, which means sort of, you know, two sections. We have binary form, which is A and then B. We would usually expect some kind of contrast in the B section, which I think Saw does. But we need to look carefully at this because we do find a repeat to the opening theme at the end of the B section, and so that makes it that's called rounded binary form, where you have, if you think of a circle, you start there, you go to the B section, and then you go back to the A section at the end of the B section, but it's still in there's two distinct sections. It's a subtle difference between rounded binary and ternary form. So we have those repeats there that give us the clues, and we have this repeat to the A section at the end of the B section. So I said in the B section we expect some contrast. So now what we normally expect is modulation, a change of key, and I think it changes. So it begins in C major, clearly. But then in the B section, I think it goes to G, the dominant. So I really feel that. Especially with that cadence at the end of that phrase there, and then we return back to C major. So we have there's sort of like a ternary form implied there, but it's still within the boundaries of two sections. I think there's also contrast in the melody. So in the first section, the melody is really jumpy, right? It's going up and down and up very rapidly, big leaps. Whereas in the B section, the melody is much more static, much more flat. So you can, and then in the B section, it's even static in how it repeats itself. After two bars, you get that repetition right here. You get those repeating phrases. So whereas we don't see that in the A section. So if you wanted to borrow something from that, you could borrow the idea of how he's organizing the melody. So the melody in the A section would be more, well, jumpy, the technical word would be disjunct, more leaps. And then in the B section could be more smooth, or the technical word is conjunct. So those are a couple of things there. So we have the key structure, and we have the melodic structure contrasting from the sections. Now, once again, with rounded binary form, once you've composed the A section, you know, up to here, then you actually have composed, again, sort of like 2/3 of the piece, because the B section, the new material in the B section will only be quite short. In this case, I think it's 8 bars. So once you have the first 8 bars, you only need another 8 bars, and then you just sort of copy and paste from the A section at the end of the B section, and that gives you a piece of music. So there are a couple of examples, ways that we can borrow general materials, or general, we can borrow general ideas from Pieces of Music, Adelita, and study number 2 by Saul. All right, so maybe I will, let me stop this screen sharing. All right, so now you can see my face now. Now, this is my first time doing a live broadcast. So here we go, there's a chat. If does any, now let me see if this is working. So I just wrote hello in the chat. If you don't mind, could you also, if you're watching, would you mind writing hello, just so we can see if this chat's working, and then we can use that as a way to ask questions or get some feedback or comments or ideas or anything. So if anyone's watching, would you mind writing hello, writing something in the comments, please? I can see, I think there are a few people, so if you don't mind, that would be great, so I can answer some questions. I'll give you a minute. Doesn't seem like anyone's, unless it's not working, but maybe no one's brave enough to, that's okay. You don't feel comfortable, that's all right. Well, if I don't have any questions, I guess I'll just talk quickly about my online course. So I've developed an online course that's very intense, runs over 1 month, and it's called A Piece to Call Your Own. And the idea of it is that, excuse me, by the end of 1 month, you know, with some guidance from me, you'll have a piece of music that you can play on the guitar. And it uses a lot of the things that I talked about in this webinar. It uses a lot of those methods and procedures to get you composing. It's pretty cool because I just get Sibelius here, and I use that to, you know, get you to sort of improvise or produce ideas on the guitar, and then I can notate them for you onto Sibelius. I'll just give you a quick look into how that works. So it's pretty neat. You can just do this in real time. So, you know, I can add the time signatures and key signatures. Just do 4/4 time and E major, for example, and then just get the rhythms and everything. And you can have different voices, and so you can have the a bass voice and a melody like that. Really neat. So I do that all for you, all the notation on this program, so that by the end of the month you have a, you know, nice looking edition of your piece that you can print out, and or you can use electronically as in like a PDF. So this is the process here that I use, 4 steps. So you learn and study your chosen piece. We do that together for probably a couple of lessons over the month. The second part is to copy the piece out by hand onto manuscript, as I showed you. So you copy that piece out. Then you sketch your piece. We sketch it together, you know, because things change a lot. That's why I'm very carefully chose the word sketch. And then you fill it out, revise, and edit. So that's the process there. You receive 8 30-minute lessons, 2 per week. I think that kind of intensity really works because it just forces you to, or encourages you to you know, go. It really helps you to get it done in a shorter period of time. You get a folio of all your work and process, you know, drafts and everything into one place, into one document. So you can kind of see the evolution of your piece, how it evolved. You get a beautiful PDF version, as I mentioned, that I do on Sibelius. I'll record your piece for you or if you want to, you can record it, and I'd be happy to help you sort of, make the recording sound polished and stuff. And you get unlimited email feedback, correspondence as well. So just a little note, I just want to point this out. There are online composition courses. They're not very frequent. They're not very easy to find, but there are some problems I find with what's out there already. First of all, they're very, very expensive. They cost $1,500, for example. And these types of online courses are the ones where you just kind of, I think you sort of go through them. This is like a set program. They're not customized to you. You don't receive one-on-one coaching, and you don't end up with your own composition. So they give you tools, but they don't actually help you through the process of composing something. So that's a little bit about my online course. If you're interested in signing up, there is a link in the video description, or you can just go onto my website and find a piece to call your own, which is on the homepage down the bottom. Love to have you on board for that. February's coming up, so I open it up every month, and so there's only one spot available at the moment. It's a very intense course, so I don't want to open it up to too many people. There's only one place available at the moment. So if you're interested, please have a think about enrolling for that. I'd be happy to chat with you if you have questions or anything. More than happy to chat with you and discuss what piece you want to model and the process and time commitment and everything like that. But I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and if you have watched to the end, hopefully I can catch you and send you this the handbook that I used for this webinar if you haven't got it already. If you don't have it already, just feel free, just message me, go to my website, to my contact page, and just say, hey, I watched your webinar and I'd love to get your composition handbook. I'll be happy to send it to you. So all right, well, thank you. I think I'll finish up here a little early. I don't think there's any questions, unless I'm new to this, so I don't know how it all works. I see a chat box next to me, but I don't see any comments. So if there were questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. But if you have personal questions, if you feel more comfortable messaging me, feel free to do that anytime by email, or just go to my contact form on my website. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for being part of this. I really enjoyed sort of talking through this whole process, because it's sort of a unique experience for me to do this. And I hope to hear from you, and thanks for joining. All the best.